faithfully sharing value, interpreting great books from around the world. Hi, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today I'm going to interpret for you this book, Albert Camus' novel, The Plague. You know, disasters are pretty common things, but when disaster hits, folks still struggle to believe how they could think the plague would ruin their plans, mess up their trips and arguments, you know? They think they're free as a bird, but little do they know, as long as disaster's around, true freedom just ain't possible. This quote is from Albert Camus' novel, The Plague, published more than 50 years back. It depicts how a city in North Africa got hit by the plague out of nowhere, and the folks there fought tooth and nail against it. Since early 2020, the COVID pandemic hit the world hard, and battling this virus has kind of become part of our daily grind. All this is just so similar to what Camus talked about. Albert Camus was a big-name French writer, novelist, essayist, playwright, and a master of existentialist literature. Back in 1947, the Western world was still reeling from World War II's sorrow, and Camus, only 34 years old, wrote The Plague. It uses the plague as a symbol for war in the times, tackling human spirit and ethics, and it's had a huge impact across Europe and the globe. 10 years later, in 1957, Camus snagged the Nobel Prize in Literature. And the plague? It was once a super deadly pandemic back in the day. In the 14th century, it killed tens of millions in Europe and was dubbed the Black Death. In the Renaissance, Italy's Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, spinning tales from Florence under the Black Death. In wartime, seeing fascism gobble up innocent lives like a virus, Camus couldn't keep quiet. He aimed to reflect on folks' sufferings by painting a picture of a plague. Camus himself never went through a big pandemic. His know-how on the plague came straight from medical and history books. To nail the plague description professionally, he dug deep into research, blending in sharp insights on human nature. That's what makes this novel a classic. Next up, I'll give a quick rundown of the plot, then dive into the novel's deep thoughts by looking at characters, background, and all that. First off, let's check out the main story. The plague set in Oran, a small Algerian port city, in the 1940s. Just an ordinary place where folks lived pretty dull lives. Camus wrote in a chronicle style, dividing the novel into 5 parts. In the first part, the plague descends upon Oran one April morning. The protagonist, Doctor Rieux, spots the first dead rat without alarm, but then more and more dead rats pop up on the streets. Over 10 days later, folks start showing symptoms like high fever and inflammation, and more get infected and pass away. At this point, Rieux and some seasoned old docs suspect it's the plague and push the government to take it seriously, but bureaucrats brush it off, saying it'd cause public panic. Only when the epidemic spiraled out of control did they have to order a lockdown. In the second part, after lockdown, Oran turns into an isolated island. People's lives change big time, and panic starts creeping in. Folks in the city long for their distant loved ones.
Outsiders, like the reporter Rambert, get stuck in the city, unable to head home.
Rieux's wife is at a sanatorium outside town, and they can only stay in touch through telegrams. Soon, food shortages hit, and merchants start making a killing off it.
People realize that to fight the plague, they shouldn't just sit back and take it.
Dr. Rieux keeps busting his hump to save patients. A passionate citizen, Tarrou, leads the charge in setting up volunteer squads. His call sparks many small teams, and a clerk named Grand joins in. The reporter Rambert, finally moved by Dr. Rieux, also signs up for the volunteer team. Doctors and regular folks team up to battle the epidemic, becoming tight-knit comrades. In the third part, the plague hits a rapid decline phase, with cases only going up. Folks gotta painfully face losing loved ones. Panic slowly turns to rage and despair, and some lose it, openly looting and setting fires. Dignity's out the window, and proper burials become a real struggle. Lost lives just become cold numbers. Trams packed with corpses run nonstop. By the fourth part, folks are used to living with the plague, not shocked by pandemic news anymore, and not hoping for a quick end. Dr. Rieux and the volunteer squad members are wiped out. Father Panaloo first thought the plague was God's punishment, but after seeing a kid die bravely, he's shaken and decides to join the fight. Oh, at this point, vaccine research takes a turn for the better, and death numbers start dropping. Finally, the plague fades away, and the small city of Oran gets ready to reopen. However, just as people were cheering and celebrating, Tarrou and the priest unfortunately caught the plague and died. Rieux also received news that his wife had passed away at the sanatorium. Though the plague ended, its nightmare effects lingered. Rieux remained vigilant and began reflecting on the meaning of disaster and survival. The story of the plague isn't complicated, but Camus' writing covers bureaucrats, journalists, doctors, priests, and ordinary folks, painting this vivid picture of humanity under the pandemic. After the plague broke out, the city showed these chilling scenes: food shortages, unscrupulous merchants jacking up prices for profit, and bureaucrats refusing to face the pandemic head-on for fear of causing panic, missing that early prevention window. Worried about causing panic, they refused to acknowledge the outbreak, missing that crucial early window for epidemic control. Citizens also became anxious and suspicious of each other, fearing their neighbors might pass the plague to them. Camus wrote how bizarre bus scenes became. Everyone sat back to back to avoid infecting each other. Once the bus stopped, crowds rushed off, hurrying away to be alone. With such foul moods, quarrels happened all the time, becoming like this chronic disease. In disaster times, everyone faces tests of family bonds, friendships, love, and even faith. Choosing between personal happiness and the collective well-being becomes this ethical dilemma. Dr. Rieux and journalist Ramberg represent these two different approaches. Rieux was the first to spot the outbreak, and he treated the very first infected patient. As the plague spread, he clearly realized his duty as a doctor. Despite his seriously ill wife being away, he put aside his own safety and always stood on the front lines. Journalist Ramberg, a stranger to the city, got stuck in Oran on business.
At first, he didn't care about the outbreak. After lockdown, he just wanted to escape back to his girlfriend, even bribing border guards to help him out.
In his eyes, personal happiness outweighed the collective well-being. Romance was the joy he chased after. But later, learning Dr. Rieux's wife was stuck outside Oran, just like he couldn't go home, Ramberg felt this empathy. Gradually, he changed his mind and decided to stay and join the volunteers. He told Rieux, "If I only cared about my own happiness, I'd feel ashamed. It'd even taint my love. In a city under siege, there's no difference between collective and individual. Everyone's a victim of this disaster, so he decided to fight the epidemic together." If readers think the novel portrays Rieux and Ramberg to praise some heroic spirit of sacrificing the individual for the collective, they've misunderstood Camus.
On the contrary, this glorification of heroism is exactly what Camus wanted to oppose.
Between Ramberg and Dr. Rieux, there was a deeply meaningful conversation. At first, Ramberg refused to join the volunteer epidemic prevention team because he felt the lockdown was Oran's business, nothing to do with him, an outsider. He said, "I don't believe in heroism. I know it's easy to pull off. What interests me is for a man to live and die for those he loves." Dr. Rieux then told Ramberg that all this had nothing to do with heroism, but was a matter of politics. The only way to fight the plague is with integrity. In my case, my integrity means doing my job well. What Rieux saw first was a doctor's duty, a kind of politics, not heroism nor sacrificing oneself for the collective. Here, politics means having a humble, objective understanding of reality. It was through Dr. Rieux that Ramberg gradually realized that as long as the plague lasted, no one could escape. They had to face it together with those around them, and this erased the distance between doctors and the public, binding Ramberg's fate to Oran. Camus' moral view is also embodied in the minor character Grand. Grand was a timid government clerk with simple kindness. He actively joined the volunteers, working tirelessly without recognition while pursuing his small dream, writing a great novel. These filled all his time, yet he never tired of it. Hey! Camus believed that if there had to be a hero in this story, he'd recommend this seemingly insignificant grand.
Because he had just a little kindness and what seemed like a laughable ideal.
So, you see, resisting the plague isn't about heroism. It's about an ordinary kind of goodness. Whether for personal happiness or collective well-being, doctors and ordinary folks can act together. In this sense, Camus created a space where people share the same breath and fate, each doing their part to build a connected human community. This is Camus's humanitarian sentiment. If humanitarianism is the surface meaning of this work, then what Camus delves deeper into is his historical sentiment, which is the important symbol of the plague. Nazi totalitarianism. We can't ignore the historical context of this work. Camus began brewing his creation. The plague truly occurred in 1940 after Paris was occupied by German fascists. The history of Nazi aggression and the resistance movement is key to understanding this novel. Therefore, this novel transcends disaster narrative and becomes a fable. In 1955, in an open letter to French thinker Roland Barthes, Camus said, "Although I hope the plague can be read in multiple ways, the most obvious content is Europe's resistance against fascism." In 1913, Camus was born in Mondovi, French Algeria. The following year, his father unfortunately died in World War I, and his mother had to move with Camus to his grandmother's house, living in the slums of Algiers, the capital. Life was extremely difficult, but young Camus soon showed talent. In 1932, 19-year-old Camus enrolled in the University of Algiers.
After Hitler came to power, Camus actively joined the anti-fascist movement, joined the French Communist Party, went to Paris to participate in the resistance, and edited the underground newspaper Combat.
During the fall of Paris, Camus was forced to return to Algeria. He taught for 18 months in the city of Oran, and this period of life inspired him to conceive The Plague. In fact, a chapter of The Plague was published in fascist-occupied territory as a combat pamphlet. In the typed manuscript of The Plague held in the French National Library, Camus once made a typo, writing war instead of plague, showing his inner anxiety. Camus quoted British novelist Daniel Defoe at the beginning of the novel. "It is as reasonable to represent one kind of imprisonment by another as it is to represent anything that really exists by that which exists not."
Yeah.
The imprisonment in this quote refers precisely to the totalitarian tyranny during Nazi Germany's occupation of France, the ruthless deprivation and pressure on the people. And in 1939, Camus tried to enlist in the army, but his physical condition made him unfit. Finally, he became the editor-in-chief of Combat, hoping to record France's darkest hour in words and awaken the people's fighting spirit. In 1942, while Camus was recuperating in southern France for his lung disease, Allied forces landed in Algeria and German troops occupied southern France, leaving Camus cut off from his family and filled with anxiety. This experience mirrored the plight of characters in his novel. In his diary that year, Camus described the rampaging German soldiers as like rats. The French under fascist tyranny lived like those during medieval plagues, isolated, enduring separation and torment. War and violence are the true plague in human hearts. This murder between humans is a disaster more terrifying than any epidemic. Characters in the plague also sought resistance. Tarrou, founder of the Volunteer Epidemic Prevention Team, was a true idealist. At 17, witnessing his prosecutor father sentence a defendant to death profoundly shocked him, setting him on a path to defend life and oppose capital punishment. He believed that while laws prohibit harming others, they themselves take lives and take pride in this power, a paradox that terrified him. He said, "The plague is in all of us." To him, the plague represented the rationalization of violence, taking lives in the name of justice. To create a world without killing, Tarrou volunteered to establish epidemic prevention teams, fighting the plague with all his might. War is capital punishment packaged as justice. In this sense, Tarrou's resistance to capital punishment symbolized the French resistance against Nazi totalitarianism. Unlike Rieux, after recognizing the absurdity and violence of the death penalty, Tarrou constantly sought inner peace. He wondered how an atheist like himself could become a saint. Everything Tarrou did during the plague wasn't practical resistance like Rieux's, but driven by pure idealistic pursuit. So, did he ultimately find this peace? Camus's answer is no. At the novel's end, just as the plague battle saw hope, Tarrou tragically contracted the disease. Camus wrote, "The night brought no struggle, only silence. The silence of defeat." Rieux clearly felt this was the final defeat, one that ended the war yet turned peace itself into an incurable wound. With Tarrou's death, the battle against the plague finally ceased. But Rieux knew that peace is only temporary. Someday, the plague will come back.
Just like human wars, which may seem to stop on the surface, but violence still rampages through the world. Permanent peace doesn't exist.
Therefore, the idealist Tarrou failed, and only through humility and a down-to-earth spirit, through constant struggle, can one find peace. Even though the shadow of the plague still lurks, shared memories have been preserved. However, the plague isn't just a reflection on the war era. Camus also delves into philosophical depths. In his 1942 diary, Camus wrote, "I want to use the plague to express the oppression we've endured and the atmosphere of threat and exile we live in. At the same time, I want to expand this meaning to the general concept of existence. In the locked-down city of Oran, people constantly face the threat of death and the shock to their values. Now, humanity is also suffering from the era's disease of nihilism." Camus uses the extreme state of the plague to examine the distortions in human existence and also to scrutinize the legitimacy of the Christian worldview.
Facing brutal disasters and the blurred foundations of value judgments, religion can't guide human life. How on earth should we act?
Cotard is the most dramatic character in the novel. He was a wanted fugitive who escaped punishment due to the pandemic and couldn't survive under normal social order. During the plague, he thrived instead. He followed merchants smuggling and selling alcohol, making a fortune. But when the plague ended and society returned to normal, he knew he still had to go to prison because he couldn't accept such a change. He went mad, shot at people, and was finally arrested by the police.
Behind Cotard's absurd behavior lies the nihilism and chaos in value order caused by the plague.
In Camus's view, losing value, judgment is the most terrifying aspect of the plague. Resigning to despair, people giving up resistance and descending into depravity due to nihilism, this is more terrifying than despair itself. Facing the situation of value nihilism, Cotard chose depravity, while Father Panelou chose faith. At the beginning of the plague, this priest preached everywhere, firmly believing that religion could save them from this disaster. But when he saw a young child infected with the plague, the tiny body being consumed by the virus, with life counting down, the deeply shaken priest choked up while praying for the child. Camus wrote that there's evil that seems necessary and evil that seems unnecessary. There are sinners who fall into hell, and there's the death of a child. You know, if someone like Don Juan, that dissolute scoundrel, getting struck by lightning is deserved, then this child suffering so much just doesn't make sense. The suffering of a child is an insult to human thought and spirit. Death, especially of an innocent child, is the most unforgettable torment. Although the priest clung to his faith, faced with real suffering, he was deeply shaken and realized that relying solely on prayer's power wasn't enough. So he joined the epidemic prevention volunteer team too, fighting alongside others, and reached a kind of agreement with Dr. Rieux. Therefore, Dr. Rieux told the priest, "Let's work together. It's this thing beyond gods and prayers that brings us together, and that alone matters." Camus believed that in human nature, the good outweighs the bad. Evil exists almost always because of ignorance. Even good intentions, if unwise, can cause the same damage as wickedness. Doctrine can't help people overcome the plague. Folks wipe away all past memories and don't have time to hope for the future, so they can only stand in the present and rebel against the absurdity here and now. Dr. Rieux's rebellion is both individual and collective. His personal strength and practical actions have drawn more and more people into this battle. Camus wrote in his notebook, "The plague proves that the absurd itself teaches nothing." This doesn't mean folks can't gain from the absurd, but that the absurd is just part of the world and life, an unchangeable fact. And the real lesson comes from people, from human actions and reflections when facing the absurd. Dr. Rieux chose to stick to his duty as a doctor, and the priest finally chose to rebel against the absurd reality through action. People may hold different beliefs or values, but they can all find a common ground for action in resistance. In the experience of the absurd, pain is individual, but once resistance arises, pain becomes collective, shared by everyone. Facing resistance frees one from loneliness. I rebel.
Therefore, I exist. Rebels like Rieux acknowledge the absurdity of disaster, but don't yield to it, nor pin hopes on illusory faith. Instead, they defend existence's dignity and meaning through action.
Here, Camus' rebellion also reveals a humanitarian path from solitary individual resistance to united collective resistance. And the plague expresses profound concern for humanity's shared destiny. Actually, this is closely connected to the existentialist literary thought represented by Camus. So, to understand this, we must return to the existentialist movement that emerged in post-WW1 Europe.
Existentialism is primarily a philosophical school focusing on human existence.
It fundamentally proposes that humans have freedom to choose their own existence. During the World Wars, existentialism gained popularity in Germany and France. Philosophers like Heidegger, Jaspers, and Sartre pondered, if God exists, why were Jews, God's chosen people, massacred? If God doesn't exist, how should we redefine the essence of existence? What's the meaning and hope of human life? In France, existentialist philosophy gradually evolved into a literary movement, with Camus as its representative. Camus worked as an editor and journalist, witnessing racial conflicts in Algeria, which inspired his first absurdist novel. And The Stranger. Though facing the same absurd world, The Stranger's protagonist, Meursault, and the plague's Dr. Rieux have opposite attitudes. Meursault remains indifferent even to his mother's death and his own execution, while Dr. Rieux, despite loneliness and despair, steadfastly upholds his medical duty, seeing love and friendship's power in volunteers, fighting alongside comrades till dawn. The shift from The Stranger to the Plague marks a profound turning point in Camus' creative thinking. In his notebooks, Camus described their relationship. The Stranger is 0 point, human nakedness confronting the absurd, while the plague becomes more complex. Darkness. If The Stranger focuses on the disconnect between soul and reality and societal indifference, then in the plague, post-WHY, Camus transcends personal circumstances into global engagement, using words to resist fascist totalitarianism. His writing thus transitioned from the absurd cycle to the revolt cycle.
He said,
Trying to isolate oneself is always futile, even to shut out others' follies and cruelties. We can't claim ignorance. We either become complicit or stand and fight. Although Camus admitted the influence of existentialist pioneers on him, he refused to be labeled as a representative figure of existentialism. The existentialists mentioned here mainly referred to Sartre, Beauvoir, etc. Compared to these philosophers who stress theoretical approaches, Camus, hailing from a poor background, focused more on real-world issues. Though involved in social movements, Camus always stayed independent and publicly opposed authoritarianism, insisting that people can't become oppressors while resisting oppression. So he split from his old friend Sartre, who backed violent revolution as necessary. In Camus's view, history should serve a higher value, that is,
universal happiness, justice, and beauty.
In The Rebel, Camus wrote that even if justice doesn't bring freedom, the power to fight injustice remains. He aimed to build a new humanism, which is also the core theme of The Plague. The humanism and rebellious spirit embodied in characters like Tarrou and Rieux are rooted in understanding, fraternity, kindness, and courage. And then, in his early years, Camus was fascinated by Greek thought, like the tragic figure endlessly pushing a boulder uphill. Sisyphus is the intellectual source for Camus's absurd series of works. He once said his ideal was to become a 20th century Greek. Even if life is absurd, he'd live strongly, like Sisyphus.
Camus focused not on the outcome of actions, but on the actions themselves.
He said, "My interest is in exploring how to act, more precisely, how to live when people believe in neither God nor reason." This statement can be called the core idea of Camus' creative work. As an allegorical story with a realistic style, The Plague depicts a massive disaster, but it never pursues thrilling drama nor deliberately sentimentalizes. Camus narrates in a calm, restrained way, using both first-person and third-person perspectives. For instance, when the plague was first discovered, Camus narrates from the doctor's view in first person. Natural and man-made disasters are common, but once they hit, people struggle to believe it. The number of plagues in history is comparable to the number of wars. And in the face of plague and war, people are always equally bewildered. At the victory moment when the plague ended, amidst people celebrating wildly, Camus still has an old bystander say calmly, "They call it the plague. We're the ones who lived through it. They almost demanded medals." But what is the plague anyway? It's just life, that's all. Behind this calm restraint lies Camus's worry and sense of responsibility. But Dr. Rieux listened to the joyful noise after reopening, still haunted by the shadow of that plague. The novel writes, "He knew the plague bacillus never dies. It sleeps in furniture and clothes. For decades, it patiently lurks in room cellars, suitcases, handkerchiefs, and waste paper piles. Maybe someday, when misfortune strikes again, or after another lesson, the plague god will rally his rats to pick some happy city as their grave. The plague can't be wiped out. Like war's violent absurdity, it permeates everywhere, becoming our era's sickness." In this sense, the plague is Camus' prophecy and warning to future generations. Standing in 2021, The Plague isn't just a novel, it's a situation anyone could suddenly face. In 2020, when the pandemic first raged globally, French President Macron said in a TV address, "We're at war, but the enemy is invisible." Now, plague and war symbolize each other. As The Plague says, as many wars as plagues, both always catch people unprepared. Not only does plague strike suddenly, but human coldness, selfishness, war's violence, cruelty, and existential challenges will also coexist with humanity. We each face this choice. Confronted with reality's hardships and absurdity, do we become drifting, suspicious ignorantnesses, or like the novel's characters, find courage in action and ordinary kindness? Seek common ground in differences, care mutually, think globally. Rereading The Plague re-examines today's world order and human condition. We sense in Camus hope seen through despair, love and courage revealed through action. As critic Susan Sontag said, Kafka evokes pity and fear, Joyce admiration. Proust and André Gide evoke respect, but Camus evokes love. This is something no other modern writer possesses, Camus' novels. That's all for our interpretation of The Plague. You'll find the reading notes below the audio. See you next time.